Hello, everybody. I'm waiting for Bridget to show up. If you guys wouldn't mind reposting the space real quick for us so we can get as many people in here. And we've got the Rumble stream up as well. So we're going to get ready to rock and roll. And we are on in the book President's Secret Wars written by John Prados. We are on chapter 14, where the author gets into the U.S. Special Operations and CIA's involvement in Laos. We spent the last couple of days covering Vietnam and many of the other uh, Operation Gladio, although the author doesn't use those words, maneuvers to include Cuba, the Congo, and many of the others that we basically covered in the past. But what I like to do is give you guys some of the different ways to recognize when we're talking about Operation Gladio, because obviously we've figured out that they don't always call it Operation Gladio when they're talking about it, because many people, even though they've done all of this research, they don't understand what they're actually talking about. So I see they're actually deleting people again and trying to take off my, there's Bridget. I see her. So let's get her up here. And they dropped SR-71. Yeah, they're back to their old tricks. They've already kicked me out a couple of times. They dropped SR-71. I just threw him back the co-host. So hopefully he sees that and can come back. Let me cancel it and resend it to him. So just again to reiterate, because we pick up new people every week. When you hear the words secret wars, paramilitary, gladio, a lot of those are all referring to Operation Gladio operations. And you guys remember, like, for example, Covert Cadre. That's a new book that I've got. I just have skimmed through it. Covert Cadre is talking about Operation Gladio without using those words. So it's very important when we go through some of these books is to point out what they're actually talking about and what they may be calling it, instead of just using the term Operation Gladio. And again, sometimes that's done on purpose to not give it a name. And then sometimes it's simply because they don't know what Operation Gladio is. And I was telling Bridget and Cousin It earlier when we had kind of a little telephone powwow that I found it interesting when I went on the London radio station a couple of days ago with Sonia, that one of her listeners came into the X feed where she had posted a video clip of the interview and said, "Oh yeah, like everybody knows about Operation Gladio." And I laughed out loud, actually, because not only do we know that most people don't know about Operation Gladio, if you can spend 30 years in the military and never have heard about Operation Gladio, I'm going to go ahead and say most people don't know what it is. And then, of course, being the little sleuth that I am, I went on his profile and searched for the word Gladio. It came up 0 times. So if you know all about it and you're all about exposing the truth, why have you never mentioned Operation Gladio at all on X? And since you're so fluent in talking about it. And of course he goes, oh, no, not here. Not here. I talk about it in videos. And I'm like, okay, well, I looked at your profile and I didn't see any videos. So whatever. We're here to make sure that everyone knows what it is, and we're going to make it a household name, or we're going to die trying. And Tara, thank you for commenting on my hat. I love it. It's a big cross in studded rhinestones. So I love it. Also, I just happened to look out on my door because occasionally, every so often, I'll get a book delivered. And I had ordered this one based on a source in one of the research articles that I was reading, and it's called House of War: The Pentagon and the Disastrous Rise of American Power. I know that this is going to be one of those books that basically tries to push off all of the responsibility of the CIA Operation Gladio stuff onto the military, but it's still worth reading because it's important to understand the different perspectives that are out there so that you can counter the narrative. So I'm just going to add that to my stack over here of books needing to be read. And that is growing steadily, unfortunately, because I've been on another research project, which is requiring me to do a bunch of research on the web back in the period that I've been posting about on the Warburg series. And that's taking quite a bit of my free time that I normally use to read these books. So I do have a couple picked out for our next book, but I'm not sure which one we're going to do yet. Because oftentimes what happens is I'll get one in the mail and start reading it and then decide, oh my God, we've got to do this one. So I don't want to announce what it's going to be too prematurely because I don't want to switch up on you guys. All right. Having said all of that, let's get back to the High Plateau. That's the name of the chapter. And this one, like I said, starts in the reason why they call it the High Plateau, because I don't know if you guys have, I would suggest that you actually look, because this is a phenomenon. I actually did get to see it. It's quite amazing. It's called the Plain of Jars. When I went on my trip to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, and Japan, we were the first, there was 15 of us in the group that I went with, all out of Air War College, and we were the first military back in Laos since Vietnam War. They had just, like the week before, gotten their first ambassador since then. And we got to have dinner with the new ambassador. It was quite an amazing trip, obviously, but I have a completely different perspective having actually been there and walked around, walked through the different military bases where they staged the special operations stuff in Laos, walking across the Friendship Bridge, going to all of the special operators' favorite restaurants that are there right on the other side of the bridge into Laos. Just a really weird kind of deja vu, having read so much about that conflict and, you know, all of the approved sources, because now I know so much more about it. I would absolutely love to go back now that I know what the real story is, and kind of retrace my footsteps. But anyway, except for going to the killing fields, I don't really want to do that again. Once you see that, you can never unsee it. Okay. So in Laos, paramilitary action and political manipulation went to new heights never attempted in the US. The previous paramilitary efforts of the CIA had always been hampered in one way or the other. Actions had been impeded either by the United States government reluctance to show its hand, like in the Cuba-Albania operations, or that there were a lack of truly popular indigenous groups in order to recruit, like the made-up ones that they tried to do in Tibet in China. The South Vietnam, there were other agencies like the Pentagon with a better claim to the command and control aspect. But in Laos, only in Laos were they basically unleashed to do whatever they wanted to do with no supervision. So, the insurgency was, according to the author, was increasing in South Vietnam, and the North was using Laos as an avenue. Thus, Laos became the front lines to the struggle against the North. Bases were plentiful both in the South and in neighboring Thailand, another American ally. And that's where they staged a lot of the flights out of Udorn. We were actually there. And oh my God, I do have to tell you guys this story. So at the air base Udorn, which again was a huge military base during Vietnam, when we flew in there, we actually flew into the air base. There was this, like, I don't know, 80-year-old rust bucket helicopter that had like leaking hydraulic fluid all over the tarmac. Not that most helicopters don't leak hydraulic fluid, but anyway, this was like an inordinate amount of hydraulic fluid. It was like sitting in a puddle, and it was rusted and nasty. And you guys know I spent 8 years in aircraft maintenance. I'm looking at this thing and I'm going, what the hell is that even doing here? Why has it not been scrapped? They were still flying it. They were still using this helicopter. And so one of the guys, we were talking about, we had brought some school supplies to give to some of the children in the local area. And one of the guys that was like our escort officer actually suggested we get on this helicopter. And I looked at the rest of the guys, and we had a special ops helicopter pilot with us. And I looked at everybody else and I'm like, no way in hell. No, get us a bus. We're not getting on the helicopter. And so they did eventually get us a bus because there was no way I was getting on the helicopter. I would have been at Udorn for the rest of the day by myself. I don't care. Anyway, crazy. So at the same time, the American military command was excluded by the terms of the 1954 Geneva Agreement in Indochina, which allowed only the French military personnel into Laos and to advise the Royal Laotian government. In Laos, the CIA had to field all to itself, with the military supporting its actions rather than the other way around, as had been the case in the Korean War and was now the case in Vietnam. So let me just say this, though, because while they were in charge, that does not mean that there were no military people there. Because if you go back and you look at the books, I've got 2 of them signed by the author called The Ravens. Those guys basically were told, take your military uniform off, wear civilian clothes, go to Laos. And they hung out in Laos, flew missions in Laos. They were on active duty wearing civilian clothes, flying CIA missions. So don't get the impression that there was no military there, because there absolutely was. They were just not in charge. After the 1954 agreement, Laos had a good chance to reach its goal of independence and stability. Yeah, not a chance. It was a small country with a small political elite. Leaders of all persuasions were well known to each other, many of them related. Prime examples were 2 princes of royal blood, one by the name of, and these guys have 17 consonants. So I'm going to call this guy Soup because the first 4 digits is actually soup, or letters. SOUPHANOUVONG. So it's like Suphanobong, a leader of the quote unquote communist movement, and his brother Suvana Phuma, a proponent of neutralism between East and West. The French had some residual influence still in Laos, while an American presence was established after the Geneva Convention and slowly grew throughout the 1950s. Of course, Eisenhower's administration had no mind to accept a neutralist solution because we have learned one thing in Operation Gladio: no country, no anything is ever allowed to be neutral. You cannot just be a neutral country and live your own life. You either are for us or you're against us. They obviously said that out loud. They've meant it for decades. Um, Much as he did for Sukarno, Nehru, and Nasser, Eisenhower insisted that the Laos side with the Western camp in the Cold War because, again, you are not allowed to be neutral. Ambassador J. Graham Parsons spent 2 years discouraging the formation of a coalition government to be neutral. American aid began in 1955 to ensure that they were not neutral. By 1960, the United States had provided Laos with more than $250 million. You just buy your friends with our tax dollars. The CIA station played a critical role in political action, showing anew their predestination for a quote unquote third force. That comes up a lot, doesn't it? The secret warriors backed the Laotians, who formed a pro-American committee for defense of national interest. It was referred to as the CDNI. After a 1958 electoral upset in which the Soup Party and its allies gained the majority of the seats contested, while the prince himself was elected by the largest margin of victory in every district in the country. The young people who formed CDNI were called Les Jones. In the Laotian political capital, many of them had risen through the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and they were reformist, anti-communist, and had the rare advantage of being united across traditional clans and party lines. It quickly became an open secret in the capital that the American Special Services were supporting the conservative CDNI because they had basically paid for it. The elections in 1958 were supposed to complete a formal process of reiteration for Laos, which was under a military control of different factions, just as in China when it was pre-Mao, where they were ruled by all of the warlords, to include Chiang Kai-shek. The Socialist Lao People Front, also known as NLHX, and especially its parent, the Laotian Communist, or the Pathet Lao, dominated in the provinces of Phong Sali and Sam Nua. In November 1958, Prince Soup accepted the king's authority within those provinces, and the Pathet Lao troops were integrated into the Royal Lao Armed Forces, while the NLHX was supposed to be represented as a neutralist coalition cabinet to form under Suvarna Pho. In a ceremony in February 1958, some 1,500 Pathet Lao soldiers joined the RLAF, while 4,000 of them were discharged. But the accord disintegrated when the Suvarna cabinet fell apart in July of 1958. So it only lasted a few months. Suddenly, these minority Les Jones took center stage, gaining seats in the cabinet formed in August, even though some of the 4 CDNI ministers had lost in the elections. At the same time, 2 of the Pathet Lao ministers were dismissed. Trouble quickly followed when the RLAF 2 battalions that consisted of the Pathet Lao troops revolted, rekindling the Civil War. Now, again, there's eventually I'm going to do an entire show on Laos because there's a lot of different versions of what I just read, but we're just going to go with this right now. The Eisenhower administration cut back aid to Laos in fiscal year 1959 when it appeared that the neutralist government was emerging. But aid was increased when fighting resumed. And so we pay for the Civil War. We don't want anybody to be neutral and in peace. And it increased again in 1960 as the conflict got more brutal. As the American conduit to CD&I, the CIA station in the United States Embassy grew especially important because, again, this feeds the military industrial complex, the one that Eisenhower supposedly was against, which he wasn't. We pay for people to go to civil war with each other. We actually actively encourage it because we insert people to rabble rouse in order for it to occur. And then once it does, they make tons of money off of selling weapons to them. You don't make any money if you have a neutralist, peaceful country. In the capital, however, all was not well at the embassy. Ambassador Horace Smith initially argued for supporting the Savannah's neutral solution and considered his policy had been undermined by the CIA, which of course it had. Station Chief Henry Heckscher refused to tell his boss, the ambassador, about the agency's activities of rabble rousing. Ambassador Smith took his grievance to Allen Dulles early in 1959, demanding that Heckscher be transferred somewhere else. Allen Dulles knew of Heckscher's arrogance, but he also knew that the station chief was very resourceful, and they also knew what they had in plan, what plans they had for Laos. Heckscher had worked against the Russians and had turned into a fine performance in the Guatemala operation. Dulles backed up his station chief, and at the end of his normal tour, he was even assigned to Northeast Thailand, which, if you look on a map, means he was still involved in Laos. Taking that into consideration, Heckscher outlasted his ambassador because Smith was promptly relocated in the summer of 1960 and was replaced with Winthrop G. Brown, the Wall Street lawyer and ambassador that had been in New Delhi, which, if you follow him around, you're going to find that he is one that anytime they're doing gladio activity, you're going to, he was well liked, we'll just say it that way. And that's what oftentimes happened is if the ambassador did the right thing in trying to support the right people on the ground, it wasn't the CIA who was causing all the problems that was fired, it was the ambassador. Only 3 weeks after Brown's arrival, the pro-American government in the capital was overthrown in a coup by a paratrooper by the name of Captain Kong Lee. He was a veteran of the French campaign for Ben Vin Phu, which of course the French lost. Kong Lee remained the most vile person as far as the West was concerned because he was very, very good at what he did. And they refused to believe his declaration of neutralism simply because, not necessarily because they didn't believe him, they didn't want that to be the end. Okay, so he's the one that they deem a quote unquote communist. All right. So again, if you label him a communist, you get to kill him. So of course he's going to be a communist. Kong Lee became the strongman in Laos and asked Suvarna Phoma to form a new government. Like his predecessor, Ambassador Brown counseled Washington to cooperate with Suvarna as the most pro-Western leader sustainable in Laos. Brown believed that the new CIA station chief, Gordon Jorgensen, agreed with him. In the fall of 1960, the die was cast for a secret war. Washington still wanted no part in neutralism. Their solution was Colonel Fumi Nosavan. He was an RLAF who had also used the CD&I as a springboard to power. eventually becoming a general and the Minister of Defense. Fumi had been cultivated by the CIA and was their choice to be in charge. His personal CIA advisor was John Hazey, Hazey, who had been a veteran of the OSS and the French Foreign Legion and had done plenty of time in the area. He also had a back channel for communicating with Washington. Hazey argued for increasing support to Fumi instead of the actual government in the capital. Washington decided to take the capital position on the surface, but to secretly support Fumi on the side. The Hazey link was strengthened as a result of that. He became a very important person. In October, J. Graham Parsons, now risen to Assistant Secretary of State for Far East, returned to the capital of Laos to demand that Souvanna Phoma, the renunciation of all of their ties to the Pathet Lao, in effect abandoning any chance of them ever being neutral. Souvanna refused. Shortly thereafter, 5412 group, the assassin group, member John Irvin, IRVIN, who represented the Pentagon as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, visited southern Laos for direct talks with Phomi Nosaban. A second Irvin trip occurred before Kennedy took office. The Americans began to channel their military assistance directly to Phomi's forces, bypassing the government in the capital. The reports of the North Vietnamese invasion of Laos, which grew from a trumped-up border incident, which was used to justify all of the military aid. Again, another false flag in order to fake the intel, in order to get more money for the defense contractors. Phomi denounced the Souvanna coalition, resigned his cabinet post, and ordered his forces to take the capital. The Congolese forces inflicted several defeats on the Phomi's men before they retreated from the capital by mid-December. By that time, the neutralists had virtually been driven into the arms of the Pathet Lao because everybody else were CIA stooges. Souvanna Phoma and the Soup Guy formed their own coalition, excluding Phomi. On October 18, 1960, a little over 2 weeks later, in December, the Soviet Union began to airlift military supplies to Congolese, and the Pathet Lao began a military offensive of their own. Political intrigue had turned Laos, the land of a million elephants, into a Cold War battleground, which the CIA and the military-industrial complex would have it no other way. The Americans had been able to act very quickly in Laos once the decision to support Phomi, because the apparatus had been carefully put in place already by the CIA that was already there. By the summer of 60, when Washington briefly considered evacuation of the Americans, there were over 600 Americans in the country working on this chaos, basically generating the chaos. One special feature of the U.S. operating mission in Laos was the military representation was not restricted to an attaché. There was a military advisory group in all but name only. It was headed by a U.S. general officer. In deference to the Geneva Agreement, the advisor group was called a Program Evaluation Office, PEO, and had the ostensible task of monitoring the effects of American programs in the country. The PEO had its beginning in December 1955 with the installation of a 6-man staff in the capital. By early 56, the PEO was dispatching small teams of advisors with units and Thai interpreters to effectively work in Laos. The Eisenhower administration added 107 Green Berets to the PEO presence, and by the summer of 1959 had labeled it Project White Star. This was the assignment of mobile training teams to each of the 12 battalions of the Laotian forces. White Star teams trained, but were also prepared to command the Laotian infantry. The Special Forces men came from 7th Group at Fort Bragg and had been flown in from Bangkok on Air America CIA aircraft. And that's what I'm telling you. None of these people wore their military uniforms. They wore civilian clothes. And no American people understood that this was happening. Nobody in America knew that we basically had created a war in Laos for defense contractors against a government that had just wanted to be peacefully coexisting, that happened to be sharing a river with North Vietnam. That was their big sin. Green Beret in Laos wore civilian clothes and used the PEO as cover. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur D. Simons, nicknamed Bull, was the first White Star commander, and he had a tough job satisfying so many bosses. He worked for the PEO chief, the CIA station chief, the ambassador, who basically didn't know what the hell was going on, and the Laotian government, at least the side that was friendly to the United States. He even met routinely with the French military mission, which was still involved in Laos. The early White Star veterans included Grayston Lynch, who would be later a CIA boatman at the Bay of Pigs. And again, I can't say this enough, guys. These are the people that was referred to as Cuban exiles up until the point that we find out that Cuban exiles are actually gladio operators inside the United States that were deployed all over the world to do this kind of shit. Charlie Beckwith, who had later trained with the elite British Special Air Service and then went to Vietnam, where he commanded Project Delta. The White Star officers were in a delicate and dangerous position. On more than one occasion, teams of Americans were exposed in the field where the Laotian soldiers they accompanied ran away from the battle. Another facet of the Laos program, one that preceded and prefigured their efforts in Vietnam, was the creation of armed paramilitary units among the Hill tribe. This program was given high priority in August 1960, when a CIA Special National Intelligence estimate found that North Vietnamese senior cadre and supplies were finding their way south through the panhandle of Laos. Throughout this region, Hill tribes were perched atop the mountains which separate Vietnam from Laos, living on the plateau in the southernmost part of the panhandle opposite South Vietnam and Cambodia borders were the KHA. The White Star was soon to extend to them as well. The biggest tribal mobilization of all and the very foundation of the CIA's secret war in Laos was among the Hmong, as they were also known. The alliance with the Hmong came about in the fall of 1960 when the tribe began to draw military supplies from Pho My No Savan. These could only have been moved by the CIA. When Pho My's forces succeeded in capturing the capital, the Hmong openly declared their allegiance to the general. The alliance of the Hmong momentarily averted a crisis for the United States. The general's own troops were of very poor quality, and the Hmong were very good fighters. So the Hmong held and even gained ground in the face of Cong Lee's forces, who now were augmented by North Vietnamese and their weaponry, which had been flown in from the Soviets. Pho My's forces, in contrast, abandoned a strategic base in the Plain of Jars, so named for its use of the burial ground of the ancient Lao people. At the first hint of the challenge, the White Star advisors had to be extracted by 3 Air Force planes, one of which was hit by anti-aircraft fire. 2 other PEO teams were also evacuated under less extreme conditions. The contract flight crews reported sighting 7 Russian aircraft, presumably those of the Soviet airlift, to the Patient Lao. It was not surprising that the White Star advisors were exposed by the open combat, although the deputy chief of the PEO and 30 Americans served in Foamy's headquarters. Most of the PEO men were with their units at the front. The Green Berets disdained desk work and wanted to be in the heat of the battle. One of the RLAF colonels to whom the Foamy gave command of Mobile Group 15, had been in charge for several days before he accidentally encountered his Green Beret advisors, not at his command post, but with the foremost detachments. When the surprised colonel asked his superiors about the Americans, he was told that they were White Star, as though they were mobile training teams. The RLAF colonel recounts that he had almost no contact with those Americans at all. The Green Beret Captain Moon, Moon, who died fighting with Mobile Group 15, and the passengers and crew of an Air America plane that was shot down, may well have been the first American casualties in the war that officially did not exist. President Eisenhower not only approved the White Star Project, but had certain other decisions that clearly indicated his concept of the conflict in Laos as a secret war to be hidden from Americans. He approved the movement of B-26 bombers to Thailand, most of which were at Udon. There had been they had not initially been used in Laos because of the difficulty of getting crews. The lighter T-6 strike aircraft were also approved for use there, but they didn't have bombs for them, just basically guns on board. The aircraft themselves were to be given to the Thailand government, because remember, we're not at war with Laos, so we can't actually give them to Laos. The U.S. military aid to Thailand would include an equal number of more modern aircraft as compensation. January 4th, 1961, Air America was laying plans to put mechanics into the capital to service the Laotian T-6 fleet. The indirect provision of 10 strike aircraft was in motion just when John F. Kennedy took office. These were the first strike planes of the Laotian Air Force, thus a qualitative improvement in their capability. Eisenhower had also ordered a task force with Marines into position for intervention in Laos. Naval units was also put on alert. Laos was one of Eisenhower's main topics of conversation with Kennedy in their pre-inauguration White House briefings. He authorized warnings to Khrushchev that the U.S. intended to ensure a legitimate government, whatever the hell that is. And we all know that that means they have to love the West and not be neutral. In the morning of December 31st, 1960, Eisenhower joked in a Laos discussion that perhaps the time had come to use the plans that had been drawn up for airborne alert for Strategic Air Command, which basically meant a nuclear strike. In parting, he insisted to the group, which included Alan Dulles, Gordon Gray, and J. Graham Parson, quote, "We must not allow Laos to fall to the communists, even if it involves war," unquote. There wasn't any fucking communist in Laos before you started your shit. In Laos, the effect of the U.S. actions was to undermine the delicate political balance. Kong Lee, and Ling with the Patton Lao, represented one of the worst conceivable possibilities, even from an American standpoint. Savannah Phoma, recently forced to flee to Thailand, but harbored no illusions of any success. And by the extension of the American policy, he understood nothing about Asia or nothing about Laos, talking about the U.S. ambassador. At least Phomi Nosavan's forces did manage to capture and jail prominent Pathan Lao leader Prince Soup, but only for a short time. In a feat of Laotian daredevilish, Soup converted his guards and walked out of the jail free. President Kennedy did not feel Laos was the place for a major war. In office, he used the U.S. military forces, briefly converting the PEO into an open military advisory group, but he aimed for an international accord to neutralize the place. Oh, you mean be the end destination with them being neutral, like where they started? With the help of Averell Harriman, Roger Hilsman, and Dean Rusk, Kennedy achieved his aim in a 1962 Geneva Agreement. When Fumi Nossavan stood in the way, his American assistance evaporated and his CIA link, Jack Hazy, had been pulled out, reportedly despite opposition from Desmond Fitzgerald and William Colby. Oh, you mean JFK pissed off the CIA yet again? It was Harriman who engineered the cutoff of Fumi. A loyal Democrat and senior statesman, Harriman carried some weight with JFK, and he went to some length to set up a credible Laotian neutralization agreement. Harriman also knew that he wanted when CIA officers briefed him in the Capitol on their assessment of the Laotian politics and the extent to which popular support for anyone other than the Americans, the president's envoy turned off his hearing aid in the middle of the meeting. Blah, 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 blah. The diplomacy eventually led Harriman to Geneva, where there was another international conference. Harriman got the agreement, but in the end, neither side kept it. The U.S. laughed with scorn at the North Vietnamese assertion that all their forces had been withdrawn. Only 40 enemy soldiers passed the International Commission's border checkpoints. But the U.S. violated the agreement just as blatantly by continuing to arm and command the tribesmen. So we're supplying weapons when we're not supposed to. And they use the justification of 40 Viet Cong. And by the way, there were a lot of Viet Cong or just Northern Vietnamese, even if they weren't actually Viet Cong, that were married to people that lived in Laos. So you can't even count the fact that there were 40 people that came across that were actually enemy combatant, because they may have just been relatives. They just happened to be from North Vietnam because they share a border. So the tribes respected no borders. I'm talking about the Hmong people. And they were found in Laos, China, and North Vietnamese hereditarily. And that's basically what I'm telling you. They have people on both sides of the border. And so that was used as an excuse. But if you know anything about that area, it's a very lame excuse. That's why they want to keep us stupid of geography and our history, so they can sell us bullshit arguments like this. So, it is also up in the mountain area where they were growing all the opium, just so that you know. It was probably inevitable that the Hmong had to be dragged into the American War because their poppy fields had been hidden effects of the war when both sides had been using them to generate money. Though the Hmong mostly sided with the French under the leadership, and this is back in the day, in the early 50s, Lai Phong, a pro-French notable and the first of his tribe to graduate from college, Lai Phong's Hmong formed an important auxiliary force for the French to use when they needed to, and they were actually involved in the French failure at Dien Bien Phu. One veteran of the Dien Bien Phu debacle was a young officer by the name of Vang Pao, who had led a French commando unit on that expedition. Vang Pao had first gone to war in 1945 at the age of 13 as an interpreter for French soldiers when they were on the Plain of Jars trying to get the Japanese out of there. He joined the fighting forces in 1947 and became an officer in the Royal Laotian Army when that was formed in 1950. Vang stayed in the army after the Geneva Agreement, rising to the command of the 10th Battalion, which was mostly um, Hmong. When Lai Feng was mainly a politician, Vang was actually a military commander. Choosing sides was of some importance to the Hmong in the new Laotian War. Feeling too old for another war, the Lai Feng restricted himself to acting as sort of an elder statesman, leaving the main leadership to Vang Pao. When some of the Hmong decided with the when some of the Hmong sided with the Peothan Lao clan leader, uh, Vang Pao made their alliance with the CIA, not directly supporting Fumi, but basically waging a parallel war. From the fall of 1960, Vang Pao forces began to receive a portion of the military aid flowing into Laos. There were then 15 Air America C-46s and C-47s based at Bangkok, moving 1,000 tons of supplies a month into the area. The Hmong force, calling itself Armée Clandestine, the Secret Army, harassed the Peosan Lao positions and made some raids into some of the other surrounding areas. 8 White Star Green Beret teams reportedly accompanied the Vang Pao forces. At this point, Kong Lee's neutralist forces retreated from the capital and made straight for the Hmong Plain of Jars area to engage. Vang Pao lost his own village and was forced to retreat into the surrounding mountains. Worst of all, the Plain of Jars airfield was lost, endangering the supply of weapons to the Hmong. The Peothan Lao joined in the Plain of Jars offensive to threaten the entire Hmong tribal village and the high plateau. In the spring and summer of 1961, they witnessed a mass exodus from the Plain of Jars by the Hmong. Whole villages moved out of the area. Only 70,000 Hmong trekked into the mountains to make new homes without a crop or ground to feed themselves. Total disaster was averted in large part because of the work of 2 Americans who organized the system that would reconstitute the Armée Clandestine for the next 11 years. One of these men, Edgar Buell, Buell, was working at USAID and became a legend in Laos. Buell started airdrops of rice into the mountains and using blind drops at first because the whereabouts of them were unknown. Buell left his embassy desk job to parachute into the mountains himself, walking through the forest and personally contacting Hmong village bands. Villages that agreed to give loyalty to Vang Pao were scheduled for regular rice drops and supplies of tools, medicine, and so forth. The second American of crucial importance was an Air Force major by the name of Harry Adderholt. And if you guys don't know who he is, he's like a special forces legend. In 59 and 60, Adderholt was the commander of the Air Force's small unconventional warfare detachment in Okinawa. One of his duties was to advise the CIA on air operations. Adderholt went to the capital in early 1960 to set up light plane service to the Laotian capital and some of the surrounding areas where there were landing strips that had basically been carved into mountains. And they were working with Vang Pao. They referred to him, his nickname as Heine Adderholt. He surveyed the northern Laos network of airstrips, which came to be called Lima sites, then stayed in Laos 2 years to oversee their construction. In the Laos Highlands, the U.S. supplied network serviced by Air America had the immediate effect of increasing Vang Pao's forces, secretly drawing unit leaders from the nucleus of the Hmong battalions, a practice that enraged the Royal Army officers when they learned of it. The Armée Clandestine grew from about 1,000 soldiers to well over 9,000 within a couple of years. The memorandum written by Lansdale at the time explicitly noted that the CIA station chief controlled the Hmong troops. Assigned to work with them were 9 CIA specialists, 9 Green Berets, and 99 Thai contract agents from the so-called Police Aerial Resupply Unit, which the CIA had been training since the days of the Lee Me operation in Burma, which we went over when we talked about Vietnam. With the, by the way, that had to do with Chiang Kai-shek as well. With his retreat from the Plain of Jars, Vang Pao established a new Hmong center at the foot of one of the tallest mountains south of the plateaus. Pop Buell, which is what they referred to him as, set out on a 58-day march across the circumference of the Plain of Jars to bring the Hmong villagers together. In December 1961, the Hmong opened 2 new bases farther west, which became main centers of the Hmong movement. One of them served as Vang Pao's headquarters for over a decade, and became a major mountain commercial center and a rallying point for the Hmong. Sam Thung became an administrative and medical education center where they could train the troops. The consolidation of this Hmong refuge continued for about 5 years. The Geneva Convention of 1962 had little effect on the CIA. They never stopped doing the entire time what they had been doing. It was all done disingenuously. The CIA met the requirement for quote-unquote withdrawal of foreign troops by pulling its people back to the bases in Thailand, from which they would simply fly to their jobs in Laos instead of camping out in Laos. Repeatedly, the Peotan Laos warnings before the ceasefire date were ignored. It is not surprising that the Laotian conflict continued virtually unabated after the 62 negotiations, because they were not done in good faith. The neutralist solution was still fundamentally unacceptable to the US and became increasingly unacceptable to everyone. Known by its radio handle, Sky, one of the cities, Long Tieng, became the nerve center of the CIA's secret war. The Lima site airstrip and landing techniques were perfected to the point that the C-130s could get rid of the entire palletized cargo in a quick flyby. Smaller Air America planes could relay the cargo to the outlying Lima sites. So they would just airdrop it as they, and they actually showed us when we were there, the C-130 would do like their rapid descent, go parallel to the runway as if they were going to land, drop all the supplies, and then take back off in like an emergency takeoff, because they have afterburners on them, and because they're flying in the mountains, and that's very treacherous. So then the smaller cargo aircraft, which could use the short runways, would gather up all the supplies and take them to the outpost. All right. Secret warfare in Laos assumed the dynamic, freewheeling style of air operations. They were the epitome of the style embodied by another American who attained legendary status, which was Anthony Poshepny, and I'm going to spell his last name, Poshepny. He was a CIA cowboy. He was also nicknamed Tony Poe, like Tonypo, because his name's Anthony Poe something. Okay. Everywhere he went everywhere with a mouth guard, like he was still on a boxing team. He flew in from the CIA Thailand base in 1963 and was assigned as a senior advisor to Vang Pao, or another name, Sky Chief. He had been transferred up from the Cambodian border, where he had been working with anti-government rebels in the country, in Cambodia. He also had been in the CIA training Camp Perry class of 1953. He had been one of the paramilitary officers that landed in Indochina during Pemesta affair and had been working extensively on the Tibetan operation. So, in other words, just another guy in the CIA doing CIA Operation Gladio all over Asia. Tony Poe presided over an intensification of the clandestine war. Van Pal struck his greatest blow yet under his tutelage. And they basically had destroyed a Peothan Lao supply road by dynamiting it and bringing down the side of a mountain. The clandestine group was significantly stronger now, thanks to his training. And Vang Pao and Tony Poe worked out a program to increase the Hmong striking power with units patterned off of South Vietnamese type arrangements. Some 10,000 Hmong were formed into special guerrilla units. And they would later be supplied with 75 and even 105 millimeter mountain guns, the latter usually lifted from mountaintop to mountaintop by Air America helicopters. Such growth was not instantaneous, nor was it achieved without difficulty. Throughout 63 to 65, the buildup period, USAID was instrumental in increasing the support for Vang Pao. There was food dropped into villages to feed them. There were modern hospitals that were set up to take care of them. They even built schools for their families in the villages. They set up training companies. Gradually, Vang Pao acquired the image of a man who had been leading his tribe through a modern era. For the CIA, the Hmong became a model of nation building, in the middle of a war. The political action approach to foster these civic institutions in hopes that your client would co-opt with American policies. In the 1950s, the tactic had seemed successful when practiced by Ed Lansdale in the Philippines and with Diem in South Vietnam, because it was accompanied with violence. It was out of fear that they got people to comply with them, not because they were good at building nations. Let's see. Nation building among the Hmong indeed carried with it new political problems. In the Central Highlands and around the Plain of Jars, the CIA was in effect creating nations within nations. Activities like those were possible only to the degree that the central government was willing to extend autonomy to these people. Saigon triggered the Hmong political crisis of 64-65 precisely by moving to reduce the autonomy accorded to them in the Central Highlands. The CIA relative success with Vang Pao was the result of the Royal Laotian government being too weak to assert its authority over the tribesmen. From the American strategic standpoint, the Indochina War, however, the need to keep the Laotian capital weak and to give free rein to the secret army flew in the face of fostering the type of national government that would be any benefit to the long term, because they didn't give a shit about the long term. They just wanted the drugs. The clandestine mobilization was greatly facilitated by its status as a CIA project. Military supplies were hidden in the assistant flows to Thailand and to the surrounding area. Air America provided much of the airlift under contract to USAID. Funds were hidden in the military assistance mission as well, and in some of the nefarious lines of the CIA budget. But of course, we know that they're also funding this shit with covert funds that they're using by cashing in money from selling the drugs. In fact, the only remaining obstacle proved to be funding. The expansion of the clandestine operation after 1964 could not be accomplished without significant more money. Although the CIA budget was secret, the small subcommittees in Congress wouldn't approve more money. To obtain congressional approval, the CIA relied on its recognized role as counterinsurgency doctrine, and then they would lie about the intelligence to support the money that they wanted. The agency was also not above exaggerating its presentations, i.e., lying. The Langley desk officer, Ralph McGehee, McGehee, who handled Thai matters at the headquarters after a tour in the field, recalled being flattered one day when Far East Division Chief William Colby invited him to present parts of the CIA case. The briefing was eventually approved by the plan's Des Fitzgerald and went to Congress with a request to fund over 100 secret army units. Vang Pao actually had only a couple dozen at the time, but Langley, McGehee, and other plans officers performed a paper reorganization of the clandestine units, endowing it overnight with the required number of units, each with the right strength. The desk officer, McGehee, felt remorse over his falsification of his testimony to Congress. But Congress was so impressed with the apparent success, which was all a lie, they approved the budget, which was unknown to senators and congressmen outside of this small committee. Congress as a whole never explicitly considered the Laos request. It passed on budgets of those agencies that were involved, most of it classified. Henry Sullivan almost missed his assignment to Laos as an ambassador because Maxwell Taylor wanted him to serve as chief of staff for the new mission in South Vietnam. And remember, Maxwell Taylor was the military advisor to JFK, who he made the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So Taylor, as ambassador directed all aspects of the U.S. operations, including the Military Advisory Command. President Johnson had prevailed on Taylor to assume the ambassadorship in Saigon, leaving his post as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to direct the Vietnam War. LBJ saw it as putting his first team in place. Bill Sullivan could hardly refuse the summons. Taylor was the president's man, and LBJ, much as for JFK, while Sullivan was the State Department officer chairing the Washington interagency meeting during the Vietnam War. Sullivan went to Saigon, but got Max to agree to a posting there, and that his posting would be temporary. He then moved to Laos in December 1964, though he returned to Vietnam several times while he was the ambassador in Laos. Sullivan was no doubt anxious to get into the action in Laos. As the leader of the quote-unquote country team, Ambassador Sullivan could command the CIA station and would be responsible for implementing the second of the two basic decisions made in Washington. The first had come in the wake of the Geneva Agreement when William Colby had convinced Averell Harriman, known to Washington bureaucrats as the Crocodile, to support continued assistance to the Hmong. The second decision was to intensify the war, and this was made by Johnson on the basis of a recommendation assembled by the Sullivan Committee in the spring of 1964, of which they were lied to by the CIA. As boss in Laos, Sullivan could be certain that the American mission would pursue the program with vigor. This might not have been the case under Leonard Unger, whom Sullivan replaced as ambassador. Unger had been dubious about the value of this large-scale war and had made sure that the Hmong operation was reversible in case it failed. Sullivan, by contrast, threw himself headlong into the project, thinking Unger was a reluctant militarist. Sullivan recalls the direction of this war effort was a tremendously absorbing task. I eventually came to life with that task on a 24-hour-a-day basis because he's a warmonger. The ambassador's lieutenant and deputy for actions was the CIA station chief in Laos. In the mid 1960s, this was Theodore Shackley, a hard driving 37-year-old former chief of the Miami station that had failed miserably doing everything with Cuba. Ted Shackley used Laos to devise his own brand of counterinsurgency theory, which emphasized CIA as opposed to military action and squarely embraced nation building as a formula. In Laos, under Shackley, the CIA developed fish ponds, established pig breeding centers, and cooperative retail stores and managed vocational training schools. The stores, Shackley notes, were particularly well received by the Hmong, who were quick to recognize that one does not eat rhetorically and propaganda can't keep you warm at night. So I'm going to stop there because the rest of this, it's a very long chapter, but I think it's very important in stopping here that everybody understands what the CIA is actually doing. You guys that have been here for a long time know what I'm about to say. The CIA during these operations were doing research on how to create smart cities. They were doing research on how to control populations. They were doing research on propaganda. They were doing research on everything that they were going to bring home. And that's why I keep telling you that everything that we are learning about our history was done in order to bring it here and do it to us. So, with that said, what you guys got? Oh, we've got some Swedish people. Anna says, it's time to sleep here in Sweden. So I guess she's going to bed. But thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Glad the word is getting out. I know that we had a lot of Swedish followers, but I've gotten even more since I've been doing this Warburg series. Let's see.
And like we were talking, it's like they were testing a lot of this stuff out over there before they brought it home and started using it against us.
Yes, that's exactly what they've been doing all over the world. That's what January 6th was all about too, using their tactics. SR 71.
Thank you, Colonel. And as always, thank everybody for being here. What's really unique about what I see going on with Laos is if you look back through the 60s and the 70s concerning Laos, they were couped 4 times. The answer was, if you don't get it right the first time, we're going to do it over and over and over again. And that really got me. They were couped in 60. Then they were couped again in 64. They were couped in 73.
Which, is something that we find in many of these countries, because one of two things happen. Either the people get with it and vote somebody they don't like in, and they get couped for that reason, or the guy that the CIA initially puts in is not as effective as they need him to be, or he decides he's going to side with his people and over the CIA, and then they get rid of him. Always having the next guy in line to succeed the guy that they have put in there before. In the case with Laos, it was more that they wouldn't do what the CIA wanted as fast as what they wanted them to do, and kept trying to in some cases, bring the country back together, which again was not allowed. So, yeah, we see this several times. When we talk about the 90 countries, the 90 countries is not 90 coups. It is 90 countries because most of the countries were couped more times than one. I read one book that said that we had basically been responsible for over 400 regime changes. And regime being, kind of a pejorative word, but that there was over 400 times that since 1948 that the CIA had affected the outcome of an election or prevented someone from taking office after they were elected, or once they took office had been overthrown, some of which were killed, some of them they bribed to leave the country, some of which just left the country. And then, of course, Mossadegh was under house arrest for the rest of his life. So, yeah. Anyway, crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. So, anybody else have anything?
So glad I updated my XF because it keeps throwing me out. Just saying.
Yeah, this is just a crazy forum. Let's see, I'm just looking through the comments over here on Rumble. Let's see. What else is going on? Anybody have any updated news?
Have you seen? They did come clean about the drone stuff.
Okay.
And that the Biden administration pretty much knew what was going on, and they were just, I guess, trying to freak everybody out.
Well,
it's the short version of what I got out of it.
That is definitely something that the CIA would be doing in order to instill fear. They're notorious for doing that. So I do want to say something real quick about what's going on down here in Florida. It's crazy. The Governor DeSantis basically ordered the legislature back in session in order to pass some additional immigration law and kind of close up some loopholes in the immigration laws in Florida to support President Trump. What he has in fact done as a result of that is flush out all of the rhinos in the legislature. So you have Wilton Simpson that is bragging about the fact that he's been working the entire time to support President Trump immigration policies, and that, hey, we're part of a Republican legislature, we're doing great, and that Governor DeSantis's attacks on the legislature is because basically he hates Trump, which is hysterical because actually it is Simpson that's lying about everything. He has actively fought against every law that would curtail illegal aliens and their status. He has also blocked mandatory E-Verify for the last 6 years. Every single time it gets discussed in the legislature, he blocks it. He's also worked to ensure that because he, as Secretary of Agriculture, he basically is owned by the farmers that are all using illegals to work in the state of Florida. And so his paycheck on the illegal alien issue is fed by the people using the illegal aliens, and he is not allowed to deviate from their position, which is they don't want e-verify, they don't want you enforcing the no driver's license, they don't want you in any way inhibiting the illegal aliens, even though Florida, from way back in the day, because we have always been an agricultural state, has used the guest worker program very successfully. I mean, I remember when I was in elementary school, we had the same kids show up for 3 months every year. As a matter of fact, some of them came back for our graduation because they had spent so much time. They didn't live in Florida year round. They lived in Mexico, but their family came for 3 months, starting with the strawberry season and went into the orange and sugarcane season. So they were here for half a year every year. And some of them still come back for our every 5-year class reunion from Mexico. It was a very successful program, but they don't like using it because you have to do the paperwork. You might as well just have them here illegally, that then we all pay the burden with our lives. In the case of some of the DUIs, as a matter of fact, another one was just picked up here in Polk County on a DUI after crashing his car and injuring someone. And also because the guest worker program, you can only register for it if you're not a criminal and you don't have offenses from the time you were here before. So it is a regulated way of using people, and you have to pay them minimum wage. You can't do that on the down low because they're actually registered in the system. So this Wilton Simpson is showing his ass. And what I think is very interesting is our House representative in my area, her name's Jennifer Kennedy, and she's reposting not a single Governor DeSantis's post saying that the Republicans are being obstructionist and not supporting Trump's agenda, which is true. So she's not posting any of DeSantis's stuff. She's posting everything that the opposition is saying. And what's the most interesting part of that, and a lot of people don't know, is Jennifer Kennedy is married to the chief of our Florida State Supreme Court. Judge Kennedy is her husband. And so she is very well connected in every way in our local area. And she is absolutely on the wrong side of this issue. So it's going to be very interesting to see how all of those politics play out. Money Penny, go ahead.
I'm having real tech problems with your space tonight. I told Bridget it looked as though there were 4 people in it for the first hour, and then it could only hear intermittently. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, gosh, thank goodness. Well, it sounds a quite morbid question, but I was comparing what happened in Vietnam with other wars more recently. And what staggers me is the amount of civilian deaths as a proportion of total deaths in Vietnam. Can you explain why that is? Why is it the case that it was the heaviest proportion of civilian deaths?
Sure. There are several reasons. The first reason is that the history of Vietnam started actually before what we would consider the Vietnam War, and they began psychological operations first of all, it's a good opportunity to just do a little bit of a review. After World War II, during World War II, Ho Chi Minh was, obviously Vietnam was one entire country. It was a colony of France in which the Japanese invaded and took it over. So during that time that the Japanese were there, Ho Chi Minh was the warlord. He was the guy. He was the most prevalent, pushing people back. Diem wasn't anywhere around, by the way. So Ho Chi Minh's the guy. He's the one doing sabotage to the Japanese. He was so effective at countering the Japanese in Vietnam that the OSS, Wild Bill Donovan, assigned his own OSS team to him to help him fight and push back. Now, after the war, you've got Ho Chi Minh, who now in the entire country of Vietnam is a warlord. He's like the guy. And they were given a mandate to have an election. And like Korea, they basically had divided, they being the Western powers, had divided Vietnam into two sections, supposedly only to administer the resetting up of government and the pushing out of the rest of the Japanese. Well, unfortunately, if you look in history, it says China was given the responsibility for the north area of Vietnam, and the British was giving the responsibility for the south area, which is very interesting because it was not actually China, it was Chiang Kai-shek. And the whole reason they wanted Chiang Kai-shek in the north is because they were going to try to use northern Vietnam as a venue to attack China and get Chiang Kai-shek back into China. Unfortunately for them, Ho Chi Minh's presence was not going to allow that. And he kicked their ass. And so you had the OSS, who, by the way, was still there, watching this rivalry between Chiang Kai-shek and Ho Chi Minh, and knew Ho Chi Minh was going to win this all day long. And the rest of Vietnam all rallied around Ho Chi Minh, which was a real problem because they wanted those two entities separated. And mainly they wanted France to come back in and maintain it as a colony. So Ho Chi Minh went to Europe in the post-World War II. He had his U.S. Constitution that was going to be drafted for Vietnam. They were going to make it basically a republic, and he was going to host the elections, of which he knew he was going to win because he was the war hero. He was the one that stood in the face of the Japanese and protected his country. And he also stood up to Chiang Kai-shek, which was probably his kiss of death, looking back on that. And so they basically wanted nothing to do with him in Paris, and so basically sent him packing. Well, that pissed him off. And for years after that, his OSS team came back and visited him. He was not a threat to the United States in any way, shape, or form. But he was not going to allow the French come back into his country either. He was not going to be recolonized after World War II. So, of course, that goes on for several years. You have all of the Goodyear and all of the different companies that were in there stealing all of their rubber and doing all kinds of other crap. So the French, as we know, gets kicked out. And then, of course, because we want Vietnam, because of the whole poppy thing and Chiang Kai-shek and blah, 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 we're going to basically take over where the French left off. And so the way we did that before we were even officially there is we started a psychological operations campaign in North Vietnam to undermine. First of all, we decided we're not going to have any unification election at all. Not unification, actually an election, because we know Ho Chi Minh will win and we're not going to allow it to happen. So they start looking around for a fake president. And the fake president is going to be Diem. And they're going to basically put him in office. And so they need a whole bunch of Catholics in the South in order to pretend like he's an actually elected president. And they started a psychological campaign in the North where they involuntarily, psychologically traumatized over 1 million people that had lived in their villages for, hundreds of years in the North, and put them on ships and airplanes and moved them to the South. Now, most of those people did not want to be there. And most of the people in the South didn't want the Northern people there because they are very tribal. And so that started the disconnect. And then because the American forces knew who all of these dislocated people were, because they had put them all in a computer system, they used them as the informants. Well, what do you think that did to the local villages? The local real Southern Vietnamese people hated the people that had come in and were being bribed by the US to rat them out if they did anything with Ho Chi Minh at all, which they were all very loyal to. Okay, so now you've got the South people who have a soft spot for Ho Chi Minh because he's their war hero, killing the Northern people that the CIA had involuntarily, and the Catholic Church, by the way, had involuntarily relocated down to the South as rats. And then you had these village teams that went in and basically, just like they did in LA and like they did in Hawaii, they completely destroyed entire villages. And if you refused to leave, they burned you alive in your hut. And then they created these other villages with a moat around them, and they checkpointed you in and out of those villages. And you were basically like next to retina scanned in and out. And if they had that technology, they damn sure would have used it in and out of these moated, reconstituted hut villages, so they could control the people. And all of this stuff was done on a basically like a massive experiment. And one of their techniques to getting people to rat out the Northern sympathizers is they would take like 10 people up in a helicopter, and they would just start throwing people out of the helicopter. And they would shoot them, throw them out, shoot them, throw them out. When they get to the last guy, who is the only guy they really wanted on the helicopter to begin with, to get to talk, because they think he knows something about Ho Chi Minh's guys and where they're at and what the operations are, then of course that guy's going to talk. And so the amount of people that were all civilians, not in any way affiliated with the military, that were murdered using these tactics is incredible. So there were massive amounts of people murdered for no other reason other than they either didn't rat out their neighbor, or their neighbor ratted them out, and they literally had nothing to do with it and had nothing to talk, to spill, nothing valuable to share. And so they were just shot and killed. They had a prison island off the coast of Vietnam as well that they used, just like they did in Korea, that if they felt you had information and you just weren't sharing it, they'd take you to this prison island and do all kinds of gross torture to you. You eventually died, but they tried to get information out of you before then.
And that was the Phoenix program, or Operation Phoenix.
Correct.
Is it? Is that the right one? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so because I was just checking on this, it's the first time that Wikipedia actually has been open-minded enough to talk about the CIA's involvement in this particular period of time. Because normally I check Wikipedia when you were talking, and it gives you a completely different picture. But refreshingly, there is a whole section on the Phoenix program, and it actually says that it blames the Phoenix program on neutralizing 81,740 people, mainly citizens. The number of neutral citizens killed, the highest of any other CIA program, which critics labeled as a civilian assassination program, the use of torture and coercive methods. And this, of course, was when Kennedy had started to enter the picture, first Kennedy. And this ultimately leads on to, well, obviously, I'm really interested in these JFK files that are going to come out. That was really my question.
So Kennedy wanted out of Vietnam. It was Johnson that actually escalated our presence in Vietnam. And a lot of people believe that there's so many, and I, with all due respect to these people who have very simple minds about the whole Kennedy thing, they've not done any research. There is so many facets to how many people wanted Kennedy dead. Kennedy had already said he was taking everybody out of Vietnam, that it was a lost cause. We shouldn't be there. We're withdrawing. In addition to that, you have his conversations with Sukarno in Indonesia. And he was very much a Sukarno fan. He had already announced to his inner circle that he was visiting Indonesia in January, which would have thwarted the CIA's plan to overthrow Sukarno, which they eventually did, because there had been discovered in 1933 the world's largest gold mine and the world's purest oil find in Indonesia by the Dutch. But they kept it secret because they weren't in control, and they knew that Sukarno would not give them the same deal that somebody that they could insert in there, so they could basically steal a bunch of the shit. And that's in fact what they did. They overthrew the government eventually after JFK was assassinated, and the gold company that had gotten, well, first of all, the Rockefellers edged in on the Dutch find, and because they basically paid the CIA to do the overthrow. And so they got part of the gold and part of the oil. And when they did the gold dig, instead of saying like, and I'm making these numbers up, but you'll get the idea. Instead of saying like for every pound of ore, you get an ounce of gold. And that was like the average. But this gold mine was so huge that they were literally getting like 3 ounces of gold out of every pound of ore, but they lied to Suharto, which was the CIA installed stooge, and they were basically taking 2/3 more gold out than they were reporting and paying the government for, because it was an illegitimate government to begin with, and they were pocketing the gold as it was being extracted. And then of course the oil, because it was the purest oil, it didn't require any money to be refined, and so they were making bank on that while still only giving Suharto the normal percentage, when they were actually making much more money because they never told him how pure the oil was. So they just screwed Indonesia coming and going. And so all of those people that loved Sukarno were all pissed off about what had happened to JFK, because they knew, and the CIA knew, that if he went over there, that their plans was going to be thwarted. And so there's so many of these things as we went around the world, the different locations of people that the CIA was involved with, and that basically wanted JFK dead. Of course, you've got the normal thing that everybody talks about in Israel and the nuclear program, but you also can never forget about Lyman Lemonsker. Lyman Lemonsker was the chairman when he and Alan Dulles was involved in the actual creation of the plan, but it was Lyman Lemonsker that presented it to JFK as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the one that wrote Operation Northwood, which recommended a Operation Gladio using Cuban exiles dressed up as actual Castro soldiers, killing Americans in all of our major cities in order to justify a ground war with Cuba. And he got fired. He was humiliated inside of the military, but instead of actually asking him to retire because he had just suffered the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy had him reassigned to NATO. And what's NATO? Well, NATO runs Operation Gladio. So he had, like 20,000 assassins that Otto Skorzeny had trained for NATO under his command then. So he had literally the kid in the candy shop of picking anybody he wanted to assign on an assassination mission to go kill Kennedy. And as it turns out, the French OAS had 4 agents in Dallas that day. And depending on which book you read, 3 of them were put on an airplane and flown out. 1 was driven to the Mexico border. I've read a book that said it was 1 and 1. There was only 2 there. 1 was driven to the border and 1 was flown out. But all 3 of the ones that were flown out were murdered. They end up dead within like the next week. on the guy who thinks there's three. The one definitely died because he's the same one in both. The guy that was driven to the Mexico border, you can't find his name, and I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but you can't find any more information about him. He doesn't. I don't see an obituary or anything on him, but they may have used an alias as well. So again, there were so many people that wanted Kennedy dead at that point.
It's crazy. If you didn't know any better, you'd think this was some sort of child's war game where you're pressing buttons and putting people in. But all this dressing up lark, I saw a reference that they wanted to send all the US troops into southern Vietnam dressed up as flood relief workers.
They've done that a lot. They've done that in Operation Gladio a lot. That's why for the longest time, people thought that the Red Brigade in Italy was actually legitimate. But in more recent years, they figured out that the quote unquote communist Red Brigade was largely like what we think of as that Patriot Front that we think's all feds. That basically was the Red Brigade. It was a bunch of Gladio operators that wore Red Brigade armbands, pretended to be Red Brigade, and orchestrated all of the terror events in. So it really makes you, once you realize that they will dress up as anybody and do anything, it really makes you go back and question everything.
Oh God, maybe that's why they're all transsexuals and Trump has decided to get rid of the whole be woke thing. Oh God.
I don't know about that.
And that was how, just what Colonel was talking about was what led me down the path of Waco and how we found all the garbage down in there.
Yeah, it really makes you go back and question everything. So anyway, let me go back over here on Rumble and see if we've got anything else over here. Nope, we're good over there. All right. So if you guys don't have anything else, we're going to go ahead and call it a day a little early today. SR71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. I just want a little bit off topic here, but this whole deep seek deal from China, that's China flexing their muscles saying, we're not the only ones that have AI. And what they're really concerned about is all of these AI systems collaborate. And because of the collaboration, I just recently heard now that, well, gee, you don't have to use Deep Six from China. You don't have to get their deal. We have something here in the U.S. that will interface with it. So what does that tell you?
That they were lying?
What we want to use for AI is we want to use an adulterated version. We don't want all the news that's out there. We only want the news that's fit to print.
Well, and isn't it a big deal that it's open source so everybody can interact with it, and kind of just like blew the bottom out of all of their quote unquote proprietary AI shit?
Yeah, it's free. That's the thing. That's why the stock market's been wiped out.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hilarious, actually. But I think at some point in this next, however long it's going to take, there's some way of getting us all to an equilibrium where, as difficult as it may be, until we start looking at other people from a neutral, the whole thing that they've guarded against forever, until we start looking at each other as equals when it comes to the world stage, there's never going to be any stability, I don't think. But that's just my opinion. Cohen, go ahead.
Hi, I hope my mic's coming through okay.
It's fine.
I've been following along on the app box and the recordings for a while, and I've heard Waco and Ruby Ridge come up several times. And I was really hoping you guys had an episode to refer to, like you have on Jim Jones. I found that very interesting with Alpha.
So Waco, we do. It's on my Rumble channel at the Colonel's Corner. There's actual 2 episodes of it, and it is quite interesting. All of the, and I mean, I would tell you in a nutshell, but you really, in order to understand how the whole thing unfolds, because the religious aspect of it is very, very interesting and not at all what we thought it was. And what you start to find is that was kind of the opening for me of the fact that they use religion to hide behind that. And that took me to the Nelson Rockefeller using the Protestant religion to hide behind when they were going down and murdering all of the indigenous Indians in Brazil, in Peru, which by the way, they're still doing, and Bolivia. And they were posing as missionaries doing Bible translations. And while they were actual people doing that were legitimate, one of our viewers' actual parents was involved in that. They had no clue that they were being used. But behind the scenes, as they were doing the Bible translations, and they were actually using them kind of as pointers, as spotters, like you would send in a recon team to make friends with these Indians, the indigenous Indians under, don't be afraid of the white man. We're all nice. And then once they located them and was able to do enough of the geographical surveying of the land to know whether they were sitting on oil or gold or whatever, they just come in and exterminate the tribe if they were on valuable land and take the land. And so the whole hiding behind religion has been very interesting to me as we've kind of transitioned through all of this. So it tells you that these people, in the most sinister way possible, will use every facet of our life that we feel safe in. So these international corporations like PepsiCo and IBM, they've all been fronts for CIA operations. W.R. Grace, all of them have been fronts for CIA operations. So there's literally nothing that you touch every day that has not been tainted. All of the music industry, but really the big takeaway for the Ruby Ridge, and there was actually one before that, all stemming around April 19th, by the way. But if you take their whole, when we talk about 4512-2, the National Security Action Memorandum, that was modified to include terrorism as a legitimate means of or justification for killing someone, which you just saw happened. And I'm not going to pass judgment, but that does appear to be what just happened with the January 6th guy that just got a pardon, still listed in a database as a terrorist. And so that allows them to have the ability to use lethal force, even if you're just a generic American. And so if you take Ruby Ridge and you take Waco and you take Oklahoma, you quickly see that the CIA, in conjunction with the FBI, DEA, and ATF, which they've infiltrated as well, was crafting a message that if you're a white nationalist, i.e. Ruby Ridge, or if you're a religious fanatic, i.e. Waco, or you're a veteran that's got something wrong with you, i.e. Oklahoma, you are going to be collected. And oh, by the way, he was actually in that Oklahoma white nationalist camp as well, Timothy McVeigh. So, and he did gun shows, and so did Waco. And then you've got Ruby Ridge, which was all about a gun. They have collectively set a narrative. So this is how you frame a narrative. So the framing of the narrative, if you take all 3 of those events that they were setting up in the psychological makeup of America, is that guns, white, religious people are terrorists. And it culminated in a terrorist act, which had and I mean, if you go through all of the evidence, Timothy McVeigh was basically the Lee Harvey Oswald of the Oklahoma bombing. He didn't have anything to do with it, other than being the selected patsy for it. So if you understand what they're doing, and it goes back to what we were just talking about in Vietnam, the psychological operation that happened before the war actually happened in the North by basically psyoping, and I didn't go into any detail, but if you go back and read about that psyops that they did, they took people that had converted to, because they were all basically Buddhists. They had taken people that they sent missionaries in the Catholic Church and converted, several million people in Vietnam proper to the Catholic Church. And then they used the pulpits in the Catholic Church to basically tell these people that Ho Chi Minh was evil and he was going to cut their babies out of their stomach if they were pregnant, that he was going to kill them. And every superstition that any of them had was personified times about 100 in the psychological scaring the shit out of all of those people, so much so that they got on a ship that they had never been on in their life, or an airplane which they'd never been on in their life, and left the area. And they did it through the Catholic Church. And so when you understand that there is not a single thing off limits to these evil bastards, that they will corrupt every aspect of your life in order to get you to be controlled by them and live in fear, which of course, we were just talking about the whole drones. That's what that whole thing was about. It was to make you guys fear, because people who live in fear are easily controlled. So yeah, go to my Rumble channel. There's two videos on the Waco. One of the very few ones that Bridget, Cousin It, and I all three did together. Bridget, go ahead.
This is somewhat unrelated, but I just wanted to give this to you for a or for a yay. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has just revoked General Miley's security detail and security clearance. Hegseth is now planning on demoting the general. Hegseth has also ordered the removal of all Pentagon portraits of Miley.
Millie.
Of Millie, yes, that's what I meant. I'm just loving it.
Yeah, they already took his portrait out.
Well, apparently he has other portraits hanging here and there,
Well, there's only one hallway with the former chairman. I'm sure there's like maybe a room or something, but the main hallway, if you walk down that hallway in the Pentagon, it's got all of the former chairman's pictures hanging there. Yeah, that one was gone a few days ago, but yeah, that's awesome. And this goes back to what I was telling you guys the other day, that the rank of 3- and 4-star generals are basically temporary ranks, and you serve at the pleasure of the president in those ranks. Your last permanent rank is as a major general. So he could be basically getting the rest of his retirement pay as a 2-star if he's not put in Leavenworth and demoted even further. But there's no fucking way that a chairman needs a security detail. That's bullshit. You're a fucking Army officer. You know how to use a gun. You don't need a security detail. Sorry. There's nothing you did as the chairman that should warrant a security detail. Because if you're scared to walk around your own American neighbors, you did something wrong, buddy. That's what I got to say about him. All right. Anything else?
Yeah, Colonel, I just want to let Cohen know, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, that I did post the links to part 1 and part 2 of the Waco series in the pill.
God bless you.
And also, if I recall correctly, I believe you and Alpha Warrior did a did a show on Waco as well. So you'll probably find something in there on Gladio series about that there too.
I don't know if we did or not, because we had already done it on our channel, but yeah, I mean, I know we did, a lot of the other ones over there, a lot. All right. So let's look at, the schedule for tomorrow. Tomorrow is Alpha Warrior at 9:30. And we will be here at 4. And, let's see. I think that's it. Yep, that's it. And then Thursday at noon, we've got War Hamster. So, wow, that's a light week. All right, I'll
And
take it.
President sent me a message and said your special guest is going to have to postpone.
My what?
Eric Hunley will not be available for tomorrow.
Oh,
Something apparently had come up.
okay. All right. So is she rescheduling him?
I believe so.
Okay. All right. And we've got Martha coming in on Friday at 4 p.m. And I'm really looking forward to that.
That's going to be awesome.
Yeah. So, all right, guys. Thanks for being here. Take care. We will be back tomorrow. Okay. Thank you, Annie. Appreciate that. Fearless Faith. Hoorah. Yeah, right back at you, buddy. Love it. Okay. Thank you for edifying. Just listening. Excellent work. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, as a teen in the 70s, they're fun to hang with. I agree. The Chicano workers every year from Hollywood, Florida. Yep. Well, and Hollywood is down in the area like Immokalee, where my dad used to go down every summer during watermelon season. When my dad came, he would go up, take the watermelons in the Midwest. But when he'd come by Lakeland, I would jump on his truck with him. We would go down there, generally load that day and then come back, and he'd stay a couple of days here and then take the watermelons on up. Of course, we would offload a few of them. Yeah, I spent a lot of time down in South Florida because my dad, while he did heavy, like jet engines and stuff like that, in the wintertime, during the summertime, he did all like fresh vegetables and fruit. And so he had a flatbed trailer, and his primary run was between Miami and New York with Eastern Airlines, doing engines and stuff like that because of their depot maintenance down in Miami, and then they'd truck them back up or vice versa. And so he did a lot of steel and that type of truck driving. And then in the summertime, my sisters and I and my mom went up to Indiana, which is where my mom was from, and all her sisters and brothers still lived up there, 8 of them. And we'd spend the summer up there, and my dad would come by, going up to Chicago, Minneapolis, and all of those other areas with the fruit from down here. And so, yeah, very familiar with the agricultural nature of Florida, thanks to my dad. But anyway, thanks for being here, everybody. We will see you tomorrow.